Hello, I'm Peggy Hora, and I'm a retired judge from the Alameda County Superior Court in California. It's my pleasure to participate in this oral history project. I suppose I'll begin at the beginning by telling you I was born in Oakland, California at Oak Knoll Hospital, which was the Naval Hospital. My parents were both from Evansville, Indiana, and of course World War II came along. My father enlisted in the Navy and was sent out to Treasure Island, where he cooked mess for 3,500 sailors a day. He called my mother and said, "Get out here, it's a wonderful place." And after the first winter, when there was no snow, they said, "We're never going back," and they never did. So that's how I came to be born a Californian and not a Hoosier. We lived in Oakland for my first 10 years. My dad was outside foreman of the Scott Company. He was a sheet metal worker. And my mother worked at home and did the Brownie Scout troop, and she just did all those kinds of things that moms in the 50s did. I went to Sobrani Park School and to Stonehurst Junior High, and about that time there were African Americans moving into the neighborhood, which didn't please my parents too well, and so they started shopping, and we became part of the white flight of the late 50s. In 1956, we moved to Castro Valley, which had one black family, which suited them better. The next year, my father died of a massive heart attack and then cancer, and that was probably one of the most defining moments of my life, was losing my father. It was sort of rough going in terms of money. I was always concerned about money, that we didn't have enough, that I needed to worry about it because my mother was worried about it. So I went on through junior high school at A.B. Morris and Castro Valley High School, where I graduated in 1963. And being the precocious young thing that I was, I got married right away. I was 17 years old and went on to have kids, whom I'll tell you about in a minute. And then at 24, I got divorced, and that's when I started college. So I went to Chabot College in Hayward. Just loved it. It was what I'd been waiting for 7 years. I always say I was Diary of a Mad Housewife, polishing silver or baby shoes for 7 years. And that didn't have much of a professional future. So I decided that I needed to get myself to school. Graduated from Chabot with highest honors, went to Cal State Hayward, which is now Cal State East Bay, and majored in political science. I did a minor in mass communication, and I was the first student to graduate with a concentration in women's studies. Those were the days of the early women's movement, and when we first started talking about women's studies classes back at Chabot, one of the deans said, "You mean like airline stewardess training?" We said, "No, that wasn't quite what we had in mind." So had a great time at Cal State Hayward. It was a great place to be. And of course, I needed to be in Hayward or Castro Valley because I had kids in school. So we would come home every day about the same time. I tried to get there by the time they did. And we'd sit and do our homework, and then we'd have dinner, and then we'd do more homework. And that's what we did for the next 8 years. I went to University of San Francisco Law School. My first 2 class cards I pulled up at Cal State were Women in the Law and Law and the Poor. And I've always seen law as a vehicle for social change. And that was why I wanted to go to law school. I had no interest in finding tax loopholes for Standard Oil. That was not what interested me. So I went to law school and had to take classes like contracts, which I hated. I can remember saying to Mr. Garvey, "Why don't we learn about consumer contracts or how to buy a used car? Why do I care about who gets the barren pregnant cow or the carbolic smoke bowl case, or all these horrible cases that are for some reason still stuck in my mind from 1975, my first year of law school. Law school was not the best time in the world. I had to commute over to San Francisco, so I was running back and forth across the bridge in my little orange Volkswagen, trying to get home for the kids and, still run a household. I was also working part-time, so it was not an easy time, and I didn't love law school. My son Paul, who went to University of San Diego, absolutely adored law school. And I would just shake my head at him, and I said, well, totally different experience for me. I still have one friend I see from law school, but mostly I don't feel terribly connected to it, not like I do Chabot and Cal State. So my second year of law school, 1976, I got an internship at the Legal Aid Society of Alameda County's Hayward office. And I started doing real casework, interviewing real clients, writing real motions, and I even did my first bench trial before I graduated from law school. And I won a demur on failure to give notice to a person they were trying, the wife they were trying to recover from after repossession of a car. And they never served her, they just served the husband, and so I won the case. So that was the kind of work I did for the next 6 years. Appeared a lot in the Hayward courthouse, got to know it pretty well, all the civil departments. I didn't know doodly from squat about criminal law. And we really had a good time at Legal Aid. There was a sense of camaraderie, a sense of achievement, a sense of doing good work for good causes, and I just absolutely loved it there. In the meantime, there was a judge, William Shannon Parrish, who was up for election in 1984, and he wasn't moving like he should have been for facing an election. I finally went to him one day and said, if you decide not to run, will you tell me first? And he said, no, I'll tell my wife first, I'll tell my former partner second, but I'll tell you third. I said, okay. Sure enough, he called me and said, I'm not going to run, and gave me 1 day head start for everybody else. And I got on the phone that day and started making phone calls to run for the San Leandro Hayward Municipal Court in 1984. It was the most exhilarating, terrifying, disappointing, and exuberant year of my life. People who should have been there and weren't, and people who just came out of the corners and knocked themselves out for me. Both were just astounding to me. I raised and spent about $90,000, which was virtually unheard of. I raised money all over the United States, which was unheard of for a little local municipal court race. There were 323 precincts. I walked over 100. My supporters walked over 100. I got the endorsement of the Daily Review, which was the key endorsement for regular folks who read the local paper. I got the endorsement of the Police Officers Union. People said, a legal aid lawyer, how'd you do that? And that's a secret. I got other labor unions, I got environmentalists, of course I had women, and the joke among the 3 men who were running against me was, oh yeah, well she'll get the tenants vote. Of course, assuming the tenants didn't vote. But some of my tenants were very well organized and they got each other out, particularly in the mobile home community. And there was one mobile home park where I got over 90% of the vote. My opponents were rather shocked when there were 4 of us, as I mentioned, and then during the first election in June, I came in first, but you have to get a plurality, and I didn't have a plurality. I had 48% of the vote, and one of the other guys had 47% of the vote. And he was just sort of a local wag. We used to make terrible jokes about him, which I won't repeat. But essentially, he didn't do anything except sit on his laurels and expect to win. There was one local elected official who was running who was shocked when he didn't get it. And there was one guy who was in his 60s. I was a perky 38. In his 60s, who said, when asked why he wanted to be a judge at the very first debate, he said, "Well, I'm looking for a place to retire." And I then shoved that down his throat for the next 6 months. He's very sorry he ever said that. By the end, he was sending a surrogate, his nephew, because he just couldn't take the debates anymore. So with those two gone, I have this big runoff in November. Out of the 323 precincts, I won in 319. And that was, wow, one of the greatest days of my life. We were at restaurant and bar in Cache Valley, watching the returns come in. Of course, that's before computers, so you couldn't do it like you can now and just keep refreshing and watch every time they change. And on television, they weren't really reporting the San Leandro Hayward Municipal Court race, so we had to call down to my kids who were at the courthouse down in the basement at the voter registration office, you know, and get the latest numbers. And then we'd run over and we'd put them up on this big whiteboard we had, and we'd all scream and yell because I took off from the beginning and was winning the entire time. So my kids finally came back from Oakland, and we go home. And I hope it doesn't embarrass my son that I'm going to tell this, but we get out of the car and there's the cat, you know, who's weaving its way between your knees, you know how they do that, between your feet. And my son says, "Guess what, Quentin? Our mommy's a judge." Oh gosh. So then I had from November to January to sort of unwind my practice and get everything moved out of the Hayward Legal Aid Office to a half a mile down the street to Department 5 of the Municipal Court. In the meantime, Judge Jack Burke had been appointed ahead of me. So not only did he have seniority, but he had pick of chambers. And so he picked the chambers that were mine and walked in and saw all my stuff and said, "Oh, never mind," and went to the other side of the building that didn't have a view. Always thank Jack for that. He's not with us anymore. So come January 7th, 1985, I am sworn in to the court. Larry Goodman, who just recently retired from the Superior Court, swore me in. Larry had been president of the Southern Alameda County Bar Association when he was appointed, so he never got to serve out his term. He was only there for about 2 months when he got appointed to the bench. And I was the vice president, so I said the only thing Larry ever did was turn in a receipt for all the alcohol he bought for the Bar Association. So that was, you know, kind of a joke between us, and I asked him to do the actual swearing in. I had a big ceremonial swearing in at the Laborers Union Hall down almost to the border of Union City in Hayward. It was the biggest hall, and we had over 400 people there, and I was able to stand at the door and greet by name almost every single person who walked in. And my sons put my robe on for me, and Bill Lockyer, who was our state senator at the time, and Johan Clays, who was our state assembly member at the time, were both there and spoke. Chick Sullivan, who was a member of our bench, who then moved to San Diego, she actually put the robe on my shoulders at the ceremonial swearing in. My ex-husband's aunt catered it. My ex-husband's parents were there. He had given me money. I got money from the strangest places, including Belgium. That just came about because somebody I knew was staying there for a while. I get this check from Belgium. I didn't even know how to cash it. I also got a check from Gloria Steinem, and somebody said, "Did you keep it?" I said, "No. I took a photocopy of it," which I still have, but I deposited that sucker. I needed all the money I could get. And I hired a campaign manager and a professional manager and a man named Bruce Goddard, who's still in San Leandro, still a good friend. He wrote all the copy of all my pieces, and I was able to find one of them, which I think will appear in this tape somewhere, and you'll see what a 38-year-old who wants to be a judge looks like. So we got through all the ceremonial stuff, and within the first, I think, 3 weeks, I'm sent to jury trial, and we're talking about it in chambers, and are we ready to go, and so on and so forth. And I'm just about ready to call the jury in, and the defense attorney says, "Oh, and by the way, my defendant, my client, isn't dressed out." I said, "What do you mean?" Says, "She's in the clothes from Santa Rita." I said, "Oh my goodness, how am I supposed to start a trial, if she already looks like a criminal?" So I said, "Well, what size woman is she?" And he looked at me horrified. He says, I don't know women's sizes." I said, "Well, is she skinny? Is she like me?" He says, she's like you." I said, "Okay." Kicked him out of my chambers, took off my dress, put on my robe, came out, handed him the dress, and said, "See if it fits." The dress happened to be tan and black horizontal stripes. And one of the local wags says, "Who's your designer? Yves Saint Quentin?" So that made the local press. It made national press. It was in the Herald Tribune International Press. It was in a German women's magazine called Der Spiegel. I got correspondence from this professor in Germany, in Heidelberg. A friend of mine was in Miami listening to the news and was shaving and listening, and hears this voice say, "And in Hayward, California, a judge gave her dress to the defendant." He said, "Oh my God, that's got to be Peggy. Who else would do such a thing?" It just seemed like a great solution at the time, but everybody found it quite amusing and newsworthy. It was really something else. So that was probably the most interesting thing I did in my first month on the bench. Also, shortly thereafter, I went to what's called New Judge Orientation. It's a week-long course that's required of all California judges that gets you to transition from lawyer to judge, and teaches you ethics and fairness and all kinds of things that judges need to know. And I just loved it. It was fantastic. I had all of criminal law to learn because, of course, they had given me a criminal assignment since I had a civil background. I'm looking at all the law library, and I said, well, I kind of already know all of this. All I have to know is the penal code. So I sat down and I read the penal code from start to finish, and then practiced sentencing exercises at the New Judge Orientation. And at the end of the week, I went up to the faculty and I said, how do I get to do this? I want to do this. And by the end of the year, I had started teaching for California Judicial Education and Research. And that really began my career as a judicial educator, which was just as important as the work I did on the bench. So I went to New Judge Orientation. That summer, I went to the Judicial College. I eventually became Dean of the Judicial College in, 1998 and 99, I believe. 2 years as Dean, and started a mentor program. Did the mentor program here in Alameda County. Started teaching all over the United States and eventually the world, but more about that later. So my first year on the bench was getting to learn things. In criminal law, everything's a number or shorthand. So somebody'd say, well, this is a 484, and I'd say, wait a minute, and I'd open up the penal, and they'd start to tell me, I said, no, I'll retain it better if I look it up. So I'd look it up, and I said, soon I will be fast. I know I'm a little slow right now, but you got to be patient with me. And everyone was, which was lovely. I grew to learn to love criminal law. And by the end of my career, that's pretty much all I was doing. I did all the civil cases that were sent me. I did small claims, which we did in those days. Now they're pawned off to commissioners, but I actually sort of enjoyed small claims. They were kind of a hoot. And there was a television program which kind of turned into Investigation ID, if you know that program. But it was, I can't remember the name of the program any name, Justice Court or something like that. And they came and filmed me for a couple of days. And for years, a clip of me ran in their their run-up to where it said Justice Court or whatever the name of it was. And when my eldest grandson was little, his mother would turn on the television and he'd run over and he'd stand there. There's Grandma, there's Grandma. Of course, the little boys, my grandsons at that time, didn't know that men could be judges. They assumed all judges were women. So that was kind of fun. When I started law school, only 4% of lawyers were women. And I don't know what the percentage of judges was, but it was smaller than that. When I took the bench, only about 10% of judges were women. So my role models were women in my court, like Marie Collins and Jackie Tabor, and the early women who, really cut the paths. But I was the first woman in southern Alameda County. That was 1985. My gosh, it really wasn't all that long ago. So, now we're doing nationally about 1/3 of judges are women. Keeps creeping up. Most law schools have more women students than men now. And, we're starting to see parity in a lot of places. 3 women on the Supreme Court. 7 would be better. But 3 women on the Supreme, or 9 would be better. And our own California Supreme Court, of course, had Rose Byrd as its first woman and first woman Chief Justice. And California Women Lawyers has an award named for her, which I was given a few years ago, which pleased me very greatly when I received that award. So all this education starts happening. I start learning about adult education theory. I'm teaching everything from unlawful detainers to ethics. We started developing courses on fairness, on cultural diversity, things that are still very hard to teach, and I'm still teaching, but things that are incredibly important. And I will never forget standing there in front of the first course we gave on fairness. And here was the sea of white males with their arms crossed in what I called sphincter lips. Talk about resistance, oh my word. By the time I was dean of the Judicial College, the younger judges that were coming in were saying, oh yeah, we need to know about fairness and diversity, and they were much more open to the idea. I recently was in Rochester, New York, and gave a talk called Race, It's Everybody's Business. And I started out the afternoon by saying, what is this old white lady standing in front of you talking about race? And then that was my theme, it's everybody's business. Also with me on the program was the man who became the temporary chief of Ferguson and finally solved all the problems with Ferguson. And I had a wonderful time interacting with him, and it was a really good program there in Rochester, New York. So, we were really pioneers in so many ways. in terms of judicial education. When I was dean, I insisted that everybody, this was still before PowerPoint, nobody was using PowerPoint yet. Hard to believe there was a time before PowerPoint, my gosh. These days, kindergarten kids are putting together PowerPoint presentations. But everything was on the sort of acetate transparencies, and you did it with a pen. And I insisted that everybody turn in their transparencies before the class. And the board had told me, you'll never get them to do it. And I said, yes, I will, because I'm going to tell them they can't teach if they don't. Oh, God, don't tell them that. Well, it all worked out just fine. And now, of course, all the PowerPoints are turned in way ahead of time. So if somebody's flight is late from Southern California, somebody else can step in and teach the class. And that was the whole point, was redundancy. Also, part of the point was to incorporate fairness issues throughout all the courses, so it wasn't just, you know, like one big, quote, politically correct, unquote, program. It was incorporated and talked about and treated as just as important as every other part of the course. So I continued to do all the judicial education for a number of years. I'm still continuing it. After I retired in 2006, almost 12 years ago now, which is astonishing, I sat on assignment for another 8 years through the Chief Justice's program. So I got a chance to go to different parts of the state and do different kinds of calendars, mostly in problem solving or collaborative courts, as we call them in California. But I was ready to retire from that as well, so I did. And I started an international speakers bureau called Justice Speakers Institute. So with two partners, one of whom is a retired judge from Michigan, and one of whom is currently still a prosecutor in Michigan. We started this business. We're in our 3rd year, and it's just going gangbusters. We have 15 associates, everything from forensic toxicologists, PhDs with a Juris Doctor, the man who started the drug recognition program for the Los Angeles Police Department, other judges, other people in criminal justice, probation, parole, supervision, so forth. And the 15 of us, or 18 of us, provide speakers for conferences, for workshops, for whatever needs to be done. We do a lot of writing. We do a lot of publishing. And each year when we set our goals for the year, we've been able to not only meet but exceed them. So becoming an entrepreneur at 70 was something I never planned to do, but it's just been a blast. We have a fabulous website, justicespeakersinstitute.com, so check it out. It's kind of a fun thing to be doing at this point in life. So in the meantime, drug courts happened. Drug courts started in the late 80s. First one was in Miami, Florida. The second, and there's debate about this, but I'll defend this statement. The second was right here in Oakland, California. Judge Jeffrey Tauber was the first drug court judge in California. He's retired from the bench here in Alameda as well. And I chaired the committee that set up that first drug treatment court. As a consequence, I started traveling all over, meeting with other people who were doing drug court work, and at that point it was just adult drug courts. It's now grown into several different types. There's juvenile, family, veterans, alcohol only. There's tribal courts mostly in the Southwest. There's courts in every circuit of the federal bench. There's more than 3,000 drug courts in the United States and in 21 countries. I've had the absolute pleasure of working with and helping to set up the first alcohol and other drug treatment courts in New Zealand. So I'm sort of the godmother of the New Zealand AODTC and still go at least once a year to meet with them, give them a little tune-up, practice my Maori, and just have a ball over there in New Zealand. Just 3 days ago, the new Prime Minister who just came in and the new Justice Minister just announced that they're going to roll them out throughout the entire country. So I feel, so proud and pleased that I was able to do that. And have very, very good friends there. New Zealand's now my second home. I've gone 10 times. I've also spent a lot of time in Australia, particularly in South Australia. In 2009 and 2010, I was appointed by the Premier to study and make recommendations on the Australian justice system through a program called Thinkers in Residence. It's the only program of its type in the United States. So I lived there for 3 months and learned more than I ever thought I would know about the South Australia courts and made lifelong friends there. I still stay in touch with many of the judges and other people with whom I became close. Traveling combined with doing drug court work has sort of become my specialty. My favorite way to travel is on somebody else's dime. So if I can get somebody else to pay for it, that's a great way to go. Not how I always go. But I've now been in 73 countries. I started all that before I retired, but since I've retired, if you ask my son Paul, where's your mom? He'll say, I don't know, look on Facebook. They're very used to my being gone, and then I take each of the grandkids on what we call an adventure, because I'm known as Venture Grandma. And I took my eldest to Costa Rica. I took the next one to the Galapagos. Number 3, I took to Egypt. Number 4, I took to Grand Cayman because he was interested in reefs and reef fish and so forth. And number 5, I took to Africa on safari, and it was a very fancy glamping trip with the safari tents, that have a bathroom in them. Can you imagine? And I have a picture of Madison and me in a hot air balloon over the Masai Mara watching the wildebeest migrate. It's one of the great memories of my life is traveling with those kids. So travel, still just absolutely fascinating and interesting. Travel combined with work, extremely satisfying. And when I go, they usually have a very tight itinerary. I've done everything from have tea with the entire Supreme Court of New Zealand. I've spoken in the ceremonial courtroom of the Australian Capital Territory in Canberra with the Chief Justice in the audience. I've done training for probation officers, for judges, for defense counsel, prosecutors, really all over the world. I've even done a Skype session with judges at the Judicial Center in Islamabad, Pakistan. So that's just been a wonderful thing, combining judicial education and travel. Sometimes I go and I don't have gigs to do, which is fine as well. But I've been able to make friends really from all over the world and then stay in touch with them on Facebook, which is the greatest thing since sliced bananas. I love Facebook. And they say it's alienating, but what I've found is it puts me in touch with people and enables me to keep in touch with people I wouldn't otherwise be able to do. So every year I would use every single day of my vacation time and my education time. And one of our colleagues, Harry Shepard, who's also retired, he would never take his vacation time. And when Barbara Miller, who has since passed, was presiding judge, I said to her, could I have Harry's vacation time? Because he's not using it. And she said, no. So I asked Harry if I could have his vacation time, and he said, No. But I urge you, colleagues, take your vacation time. It's a hard job we do. It's draining. It's emotionally wrenching in some cases. The weight of the world really is on our shoulders. We make decisions that affect people's lives in a way that we can never imagine sometimes. And you need that time to recharge. You need that time to regroup. We talk a lot these days about mindfulness. If you have a mindfulness practice, all the better. Do yoga, meditate, do something for your own well-being, because we see so many of our colleagues either drinking too much, having other mental health issues, or we see them just turn into these angry, bitter people on the bench because they're so unhappy. And I pretty much stayed happy my entire career, 21 years. Because I started at 38, I turned 39 just a couple weeks later. When my 20 years came, which would have enabled, was fully vested, I couldn't get a check until I was 60. And so I had to work an extra year, and it was either go be a greeter at Kmart or stay on the bench. So I stayed on the bench. But in those 21 years, I must say there were very few days I wasn't happy. There were some, but very, very, very few. And part of that had to do with having the outside interest in education and judicial education and staying involved with that, meeting new people. I just got a huge plaque celebrating my 25 years of being on the faculty of the National Judicial College. So I was doing California nationally and then all the other gigs I would pick up. Also, I'm very, very proud that I was just presented last month with the Robert V. Payont Award for Judicial Excellence, Teaching Excellence from the National Judicial College. So that really is the cherry on top of my judicial education career. I told him now I'm going to have to retire, because what else can one strive for? You can't just keep going on after that. So find something that interests you, find something on the bench that you can dedicate yourself to, and yourself keep up with education. We are told that the 3 weeks of education when we're new judges are mandatory, but everything after that is only suggested. And so to be able to take a week-long class when you change assignments is not only a luxury, it's a mandatory. The last time you looked at criminal law, if you've been doing family for 2 or 3 years, things have changed. My goodness, I couldn't go back to the bench at this point with all the new propositions and what's a misdemeanor and what's a felony. I don't know that stuff anymore. And I would have to go and be re-educated in order to do a good job. So take advantage of that education. Take some classes that are totally unrelated, seemingly, to what you're doing, because I'll guarantee you'll find something that clicks for you. Also, being with other judges and finding out how somebody else does things. We get so entrenched in the Alameda County way but what's interesting, of course, is when we consolidated and found out the different muni courts were doing things differently, and then we had to all figure out, what was the Superior Court way. But certainly people from other states, people from other disciplines have much to teach you. And that's really the way to keep your sanity and keep a good outlook. I mean, the day that you don't want to take that bench is the day that something's wrong, and you can prevent that from happening by taking good care of yourself and by finding something that stimulates you. And if you're in an assignment that you don't particularly care for, it'll be over soon. There'll be a new PJ along to give you a new assignment. Don't worry about it. It's only a year. Used to be a year was a long time. Now, not so much. They're just sort of flying by. Well, as I mentioned, I had an interest in the law from the time I was going back to school. And one of the things that spurred it actually was The Equal Rights Amendment, which ultimately failed, and now there's a movement to reinvigorate it, and I hope that goes through in my lifetime. But I was doing a story for the Chabot College paper on the Equal Rights Amendment, and I thought, well, they need the ERA in someplace like Mississippi, but certainly not here in California. But I started doing my research, and I found out that in 1972, in the state of California, you could not own your own business if you were a woman unless you had your husband's permission or permission of a court. If you inherited your husband's estate when he died, you had to pay taxes. But if you died first, he didn't. I started finding all these laws that had no rhyme or reason, were mostly discriminatory against women. And I said, well, I think we need that ERA right here in California as well. The legislature in California eventually passed the Equal Rights Amendment, but that was probably the first time I researched law. I also did an article for a magazine that's no longer with us, and it's too embarrassing to tell you the name of it, but I wrote for it for a while. I called it Marriage, the Legal Trap, and it was all the rights that you lost as a woman when you became married in the United States. So that was sort of the first research, and then second level was at Cal State when I pulled those 2 class cards. Those were the only 2 law-related classes, but there were 2 teachers really that talked to me about the law and talked to me about law school, and Malcolm Smith was just a great man and a great teacher. And I'll never forget the recommendation he wrote for me for law school. Because at that point I said, okay, if I'm going to get this done, that's going to be the best vehicle to do it. And I knew I didn't have the money to go to law school, so not only did I have to take the LSAT and actually get in somewhere, I had to find a way to pay for it. So I was applying for scholarships from hither and yon. Knew I was probably going to still be working and was worried about how I could do that and raise the kids and go to law school because I knew it was going to be hard. And I got into University of San Francisco, and they offered me a scholarship. Not a full ride, but partial. And that made the difference in my being able to go. And so when I retired, I figured out how much money they had given me over the years, and I wrote them a check and said, this is a one-time contribution, just paying it back and forward. So law school for me was great when I had Chuck Lawrence as my constitutional law professor. Chuck wrote a book called We Won't Go Back about the Bakke decision. And he's still a professor at Georgetown, and I was lucky enough to hear from him last year. It was really cool that he still remembered me and still wanted to chat about something. And when I took the bar exam, there was a con law question, and I just closed my eyes and I could hear Chuck's voice. First you have to talk about jurisdiction, then you have to talk about this, then you have to talk about that. And I swear I channeled him as I was writing that con law question, which is probably what got me over the hump to pass the bar the first time. So there were good classes, but there were a whole lot of classes. They made me take income tax. In those days, federal income tax was a requirement at USF. Thought I was going to die. Hated it. There were so many classes that had nothing to do with anything I was interested in. But there were some that were really cool. And those were the ones I concentrated on and kept thinking, okay, you have to do this to get the union card to be able to be a lawyer. But remember, by the second year, I was working at Legal Aid, so that was great. I was doing real cases with real clients, making real motions, and even my first bench trial. So first year of law school, my best friend, Marjorie Cox, and I were both turning 30. So we were going to have this huge party for all the law school friends, all of my friends from Castro Valley, all of her friends from hither and yon. And she lived in one of the lofts south of Market before it was cool and hip. And that's where we were going to have it. And right at the beginning days of law schools, everybody was talking about what they wanted to do when they got out. And I said, well, I'm going to be a judge, which everybody thought was pretty hysterical, coming from a first-year law student. And as a joke, someone gave me a gavel at my 30th birthday party, and that stayed in my chambers for 21 years. So you have to be clear about what you want and pursue your dreams, and that was a dream. And the reason was the same reason I was interested in the law. I wanted to do justice. I wanted to make changes. I wanted to be the kind of judge I always wanted to appear in front of. And through the alcohol and other drug court movement, I've been able to do that. I've been lucky enough to do trainings all over the United States, helping courts improve their skills and do a better job. I maintain a listserv that I send out to about 600 people just on, what's new in mental health stuff, what's new in addiction stuff. I've talked to the American Society of Addiction Medicine, and in fact will be updating the 5th edition of Principles of Addiction Medicine. I'm probably one of the few non-medical or psychological people in the entire ASAM Bible, as we call it. So that'll be out probably next year, the 5th edition. I've just been able to help so many people, and each judge or each prosecutor or each defense attorney who gets trained and gets the proper mindset and gets the knowledge they need to do a good job in a problem-solving court or collaborative court, that touches hundreds of other lives, and those lives touch multiple lives. And so, the ripple effect of understanding and appropriately responding to people with mental health, alcohol and other drug issues in the courts, which is only about 90% of our criminal cases, is so effective and so positive and so important because it touches so many lives. And it can stop that cycle of recidivism. 2/3 of people who spend time in state prison go back within 5 years. How do we spend that kind of money on such a failed program and say, oh, we don't have money for solution-focused courts or problem-solving courts? And I say you can't afford not to have them. 75% of people who graduate from drug treatment courts never go into another pair of handcuffs. So I'll take my 75% over your failed 1/3 anytime, anytime. So it's just a matter of reordering priorities in the budget. It's not that we don't spend the money. We spend the money now, but just on the wrong things. We don't focus on or make enough investment in programs that have shown to be evidence-based and effective. We're still doing the same old thing that didn't work before and will never work again. Along with the giving away my dress story, there's another one that got a lot of press and a lot of interest. And we had a case was sent to me for trial, jury trial. It was a no time waiver case. It was the last day. How it got down to the last day, I don't know. I wasn't managing that part of it. And I call up the jury commissioner, actually my clerk does, to say, send in some jurors. And she said, oh, I sent them home without talking to all the courts. So here I was put in the position I either had to dismiss the case because it was a no time waiver, or I had to do something else. And I had heard about this procedure before, so I looked up, and sure enough, there it was. The code provides for They don't call it corralling strangers, but you can go out and just start grabbing, send the marshals out to start grabbing people to come in and be your jurors. So we grabbed the UPS guy who was hysterical because he wasn't going to be able to make his rounds. We grabbed a couple of lawyers who was standing in line downstairs, and then I sent them over to Southland, the shopping mall, to start grabbing some shoppers. And when I had the whole thing full, then that scared the public defender enough that she waived the wave time, and we were able to get proper jurors in the next day. But that was kind of fun. That got everybody's attention. I was going to do, I mean, the Code of Ethics said you should, you have to try every case you can. You can't just be frivolous about dismissing cases. So I was taking that to heart. Probably the other story that most people love is we have traffic commissioners, as you know, and when the commissioners would go on vacation, the regular judges would take their calendars. So about once every, maybe 18 months, you would end up with the traffic calendar for the week. It was never a fun opportunity, but I tried to make it as painless as possible. And it had actually been a pretty good week. We had gotten all the way up to Friday. And I said to my clerk, well, this hasn't been too bad. Ha! So, of course, something immediately went wrong. The afternoon trials come in and call the first case. And there's this fellow who marches up and sort of slams his briefcase on the counsel table. And you're always a little wary about a pro per who carries a briefcase. That's usually trouble. And so I have the officer testify. He cross-examines the officer. He examines the officer, asking, of course, all the same questions that have already been testified to. And he now appears to be finished. And I said, well, sir, based on the evidence, I'm going to have to find you guilty. He says, then I want a continuance. I said, no, that's not how it works. And I'm looking at the docket at that point. I said, this was already set for trial once, and you didn't appear. The officer was here. You were found guilty in absentia. There was obviously a good reason you weren't here because that was set aside, and this is now the second time, and I'm not going to give you a continuance. It's over. So he stands up and puts his hand on his hip and gets a snarl on his lip, and he says, it ain't over till the fat lady sings. And I said, guilty. That ended up in what was the column to be in at the time in the San Francisco Chronicle, Herb Cain. I still have that. It was from 1997, I believe. So that was another fun thing. Sometimes attorneys who hadn't done a lot of trials in my court were surprised by some of the things I did. One of the things that they always found interesting is I came off the bench when I was going to read jury instructions. My theory was that if I was sitting there watching them, first of all, I could tell who was falling asleep. But secondly, I could look them more directly in the eye. I could feel like I was communicating. I tried to read jury instructions with emphasis, with clarity, because they're very difficult to understand. We're asking lay people to really put on a very different hat when trying to apply these instructions. I also would let them each have a copy of the jury instructions so they could have the ability to go through them at their own pace. So that was one thing I did. When I started a trial and started the pretrial conference, I would say, there are a number of odd things that I do, and I would tell the new lawyer what they were. And then I'd turn to the other lawyer who had been in my court a number of times. I said, what else strange do I do? And they would say, oh, she does this, she does that. So yeah, I kind of did things my own way. And one of the reasons was I had had one jury trial in my whole life before I took the bench. And so as a judge, you don't go and sit in other judges' courtrooms, so I didn't really know, other than what I was taught at new judge orientation. And So I just kind of made a lot of it up. When I came to the bench, as I mentioned, Jack Burke had been appointed just a few weeks earlier, and he had been a district attorney. So he didn't know doodly about civil, I didn't know doodly about criminal, and we would scuttle into one another's chambers back and forth asking questions. And until the day he retired, I still went to him for tricky criminal questions. I also went to Larry Goodman, because Larry went on to try some of the toughest cases in Alameda County. So if it was some really peculiar criminal thing, I'd go to Jack, I'd go to Larry, and they were some of my closest friends, which people found peculiar since they were both Republicans. And I was, a dyed-in-the-wool flaming, couldn't be more blue Democrat. And I said, well, first of all, this is a nonpartisan office. Second of all, that has no place here. It doesn't count. But at that time in Superior Court, there was a special little club of Democrats because all these Republicans had been appointed by Deukmejian. And the special little club of Democrats met for lunch and did all this plotting about who became PJ and this and that. And they asked me to come. I said, nah, I think I'll skip that, thanks. Because I just didn't see that there was a difference. We were all judges. We all were trying to apply the law in the most neutral, correct way we could. And whether we were Democrats, Republicans, didn't matter at all. When Reg Saunders became a judge, he had been a brand new pup appearing in front of me when I was pretty much a brand new judge, pup. And we sort of stayed friends as he was transferred around the different courtrooms. And then, of course, he was appointed to and was sitting in Hayward. And he asked me if I would be his mentor judge. And Reg is probably more Republican than either Larry or Jack was. But yet that was never an issue for us. In fact, last year he came out to Walnut Creek, where I'm now living, and had lunch. And we just became good colleagues and good friends, and it didn't matter. That stuff just didn't matter. I think the fact that we have nonpartisan offices helps that. In places I know where there's partisan races for judge, it gets really gnarly. It gets pretty bad. But other than the little crazy things they did up in Superior Court at the time, it never raised an issue for me. I also tried to help the new judges in any way I could. I got a call one day from a new judge, and he says, "What do I do now?" And I said, "What's the problem?" And he said, "Well, my jury's deliberating. They say they're hung. I asked for a count, and it was 7-6. And I said, "Say that again?" Said it was 7-6. I said, "So you sent the alternate in?" He said, "Yes, what do I do now?" So we figured out what to do, and he took care of it. But, I liked being the one that they could call and ask the questions. I also, would go out of my way for any woman new on the bench. There was a time when sort of the women's caucus, if you will, would have a dinner for a new woman judge. I don't think they do that anymore, but there was a time when they did that. Anne Marie Collins was one who, usually at her house, she did mine, for instance. And you got to meet the other women and got to swap stories. Probably the worst story I ever heard about a woman judge was a judge down in San Diego. First name was Liz, and I'm afraid I don't recall her last name, but I knew her from California judicial education stuff. And she was African American, and she was sent out to some outpost in San Diego County near the border of Mexico. And in those days, you would get your check from the county when you were a municipal court judge. And so at lunchtime, her first week there, and she gets her paycheck, she goes to Bank of America and she tries to cash her check. And the cashier looks at it and says, "Oh my God." And she said, "What?" She says, "Oh my God, this is amazing." And Liz Riggs, that's her name, Riggs, Judge Riggs. "Oh my God, this is amazing." And Judge Riggs says, "What is the problem?" And the woman cashier looks at it and says, "I've never seen a welfare check that big." That's probably one of the worst. One time when I was mistaken for not a judge, I was in chambers, the public defender was talking to his clients during pretrial. We were coming in, to make our deals, take pleas, reset, trials, whatever. And so I walked out. I usually went around the judge's way, but for this particular day, for whatever reason, I walked out the front door. And as I walked by, one of the public defender clients was sitting there on the bench, and he looks me up long and hard and slow and says, "Hey, baby, looking good." I said, "Oh, please." So I went and I got my soda out of the snack bar, whatever it was. I come back and he has some other remark. I go back into chambers and I ask the clerk to call in the public defender. So call him in. And I said, "When you're ready, let the clerk know, because I want to be on the bench when you walk in." "Oh, okay, Judge." Of course, that's totally different than it usually is, but whatever. So he gets through interviewing everybody. I get the call. Okay, they're coming in. So I go and I sit on the bench. I'm just sitting there in my robe. And about number 6 comes stroking in, and he looks at me, and he looks again. I said, "Looking good." That surprised him. Another time, I was doing civil settlements. And I didn't do them in my robe. I did them just in my lay clothes. And there were 2 attorneys there, one man, one woman. And I go out and I say, "Would you like to come in?" And the woman says, "I'm not going to speak to a law clerk." I said, "Okay." So in we go, and she's looking around, where's the judge, where's the judge? And I sort of slowly meander my way behind the desk, and I settle in and said, "Hello, I'm Judge Hora." But so many times, well, even when I was a lawyer, I'd show up with my legal aid clients who would try their best but didn't always look quite as spiffy as some of the other people in the courtroom. And even then, they'd mistake a male in a raggedy T-shirt for the lawyer because it couldn't possibly be this young woman, right? Oh, gosh.